Setting up. There we go. Perfect. Hello and welcome. Hold up. One more try. Hello and welcome to the very first episode of our Dualistic Unity commentary series, where we go back to old episodes and we listen to what we had to say at that time and what we have to say right now. We're going to share, and we share what we have to say right now with you, and we just see what happens, because we haven't visited these episodes since we recorded them. I know I haven't looked back at season one since we recorded season one, so this is going to be a lot of fun for me, because I remember putting a lot of patience and attention into the conversation when we started recording these, because I really wanted to make sure that we covered a lot of ground, but not in a way that was overwhelming. So I'm very excited to see how this turns out, and I'm excited to see what Andrew's thoughts are.
Likewise, I'm very excited to see what direction this even goes in, because it's not like we're necessarily going to comment on only one thing. It's like it could be, wow, I thought I got that. I actually said that kind of well. Interesting. I took a really long pause there. Anyway, my point is, yeah, this is gonna be a lot of fun, because it's been now like 2 years, 2 months, 26 months. Lots happened the last 2.17 years. So yeah, this should be fun.
This should be fun. All right. Let's start off with, of course, my favorite part of the series, the first intro. Welcome to Dualistic Unity with Andrew and Ray. This is Andrew.
I'm Andrew.
And I'm Ray. So this is our very first conversation. Welcome to the podcast. Just to give you a bit of history, Andrew and I have only known each other or known of each other for the last couple of weeks. I had the pleasure of running across Andrew's content on TikTok, and it just blew my mind. The fact that he was so clear and concise about the insights that he was having, and his intention to spread those insights for the joy that it might bring other people. So in wanting to spread that message a little bit more, of course, that my own content is of a similar fashion. So I contacted Andrew and we started talking. We had one interview, which you can find on my YouTube channel, and we've spoken briefly twice since then. So this podcast, as it goes on, is going to be a journey of Andrew and I learning from each other and learning about each other. So as a listener, I hope that you enjoy the show, and please do submit any questions or comments that you have to us on social media, so that we can include you in these conversations as we move forward.
Certainly. Yeah, and just to get...
Oh man. So first of all, just like for my first thoughts is how young I look in that. And also just knowing, and this is something I didn't realize we were going to be able to tap into with this, but like remembering what I was kind of thinking, not exactly what I was thinking, but how I saw myself, how I looked at myself. And at this point, it was like there was that, I don't want to say separation, but that separation between taking my idea of myself very seriously, but there was still so much under the surface. And so like the quote unquote surface level experience, like how I'm feeling kind of right now without taking so many thoughts so seriously, doesn't to me right now feel that much different than I remember it feeling back then. But it was like it was like a smaller window into that. Like there was a lot less considerations, but moment to moment, feeling wise, again, everything's relative, but I don't feel like my moment to moment experience is that different to then. But then at the same time, there was a lot of rigid lack of relaxation under the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of interesting to look back, right? Like there was an attempt to have a conversation rather than just having the conversation. And for me, it was very much just, okay, how do we have this conversation and eventually get rid of all of the ridiculous seriousness about it, right? Like, how do we get into the conversation and get to the really good meaty stuff, but at the same at the same time, not make it all intellectual and beliefy, and so this was kind of the fun part for me. It was like, okay, what am I getting into, and is this person going to run away from it?
Give my perspective on finding Ray. About 2 months ago, I started having sorts of insights. It started with realizing that I don't have a past to the degree that I think that I do, and this idea of what if I didn't have a past, and then it's like, holy shit, if I don't have a past, then maybe I'm not Andrew, and I'm not confined to this body. I'm just aware of it and aware of its environment. So I'm not Andrew, I'm aware of Andrew, or I got to sort of the present awareness of Andrew. No past, no future, just present awareness. And I was talking to some friends about this, and one of them who I was talking to sent me a couple of videos, and he was like, yo, this kind of sounds like what you're talking about. And it was a video of Ray from 2005 talking about his experience in the forest, and that when he came out, he realized basically that there was no other, and everyone.
Real quick, I'm just laughing because I'm just hearing myself talk. Like so much of how you're feeling is expressed in the way that you talk, and I almost feel like I should be catching my breath here in a sense. Like I sound like I'm running almost, and there was like a hurried sort of, and very much like thinking about the right thing to say, the correct thing to say. But I feel a lot of the relaxation and realizing how much, like, my voice maybe hasn't changed, but the cadence of it, and it's very much like I'm almost, I don't know, I feel like I'm almost hearing myself panting as I'm talking, but yeah, it's like what was coming out wasn't that different, but I can almost feel the difference in how it comes out.
For sure, because it was still, again, about the conversation instead of it being about the conversation, like the actual experience of the conversation. We were still trying to find, well, we were still getting to know each other. For one, we were also getting to know what the hell to do with the podcast. That was a big thing here. Like, we had never done a podcast. I know throughout this episode, we kind of talk over each other, and we did not mute one another, or we didn't mute ourselves when we weren't talking. And it's because, frankly, we didn't know what we were doing. And I like it for that reason. I know there's a number of times where I've looked back at that and went, maybe we should edit that up, and went, nah, fuck it. It's better if people just see the fact that we're being as authentic as possible. But yeah, it's funny to look back. Like, even me, I can see where I was nervous. I can see where I was overthinking it a bit. I can see where I was like trying to, well, I guess we'll see as we go forward. I'm not going to talk too much about it from here. Let's continue.
His meeting was just himself, and I was like, whoa, holy shit, that's exactly what I've been realizing and having insights about. And so I clicked through Ray's page. I was like, wow, this dude makes a lot of sense. Followed him, started commenting on some of his stuff. Maybe he, saw that or saw my page soon after. And yeah, that's just my perspective of it. But again, super excited. Another thing I think we're going to probably touch on is just, the title Dualistic Unity, and just the differences between us and how we came to all of this and got to this podcast. And we couldn't be almost any more different on the surface of things. And yet we've come to similar insights. You started to a long time ago. I started to about 2 months ago. So very early. And I'm very grateful to have someone, like you, who I can bounce things off of, because I get a lot of questions about these things and I don't always know exactly what to say about them, quite frankly.
Yeah, I hear you for sure. I mean, if there's anything, I regret that now. It's like, wow, really glad I found somebody to talk about this shit with. Oh, maybe not. Ah, man, that's so funny. And it's interesting because even back then we had an appreciation for what it was we were doing. We understood that there were two different perspectives of the world, two different experiences that were coming together to have a conversation. It's just that it's the depth of that that's changed over time, because of course that's exactly the point.
Yeah, like I did not know and I'm like talking to myself as we're going through this, and I know we can't pause like every 10 seconds. Part of me wants to, because it's just like constant thoughts about it. But it was like, I remember I thought of myself as, a single guy living in New York City. I thought of you as a guy who lives all the way on the other side of Canada with a wife and a daughter and a whole situation. And so my idea of the difference in us was literally in my current idea of what each of us were, still clearly expressing that idea. And yet, so I didn't realize the depth of like two alternate universes, like just as you said, like the depth of the differences and like how kind of mind-blowing it is that we've been having this conversation from, like, I did not realize the depth of the differences, and yet so much obviously I'm not gonna that's enough.
I've learned in the last 20 years it's that the answer is actually not the point, right? It's the ever deepening question, and just that state of being in the question without settling on an answer, of just being aware, right? Without holding on to any particular concept. It's just so funny because 20 years ago, I was roughly your age. A little younger 20 years ago, but I was roughly your age. And so it's amazing to me that there's almost this window somewhere between, like, I don't know, 15, 16 and about 30, where we have a really good chance of breaking our programming. We actually have a really good chance of stepping out of what's familiar because it hasn't kind of set into solid concrete yet. And yet when I work with clients who are older, they have such a harder time breaking those old familiar habits because they are so familiar, because they are so set in stone over time. So when I ran across your channel, and again, you're on point and you're enthusiastic, I just had to reach out because that needs to be encouraged. It needs the flames of that enthusiasm need to be fanned. They need to be spread, and they need to be spread more so now than any other time that I've seen in my life. Like when I first started waking up back 20 years ago, it was right after 9/11, right? So everything had changed. The entire world suddenly had become. Man, that is so true. Even now, like, it just needs to be encouraged. And I feel the exact same way. This is why I love the groups. I had no idea we'd be doing groups when we had recorded this episode, but I feel very much the same way about it. Like, just the willingness to question. The only thing I think that has changed since recording this is that I don't know if I would necessarily say that window is where things are easier, but I think that it's where there is more conversation about the potential to question. There's still a lot of younger minds that are willing to question, and so there is more potential to run into those conversations, whereas when you get older, you don't run into those conversations as often because usually at that point people have kind of settled into their routine. But I wouldn't say that it's easier at that point of age anymore. I would just say it's more likely because of the environment.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And as you were saying, as we get older, it's almost like coming through certainty throughout our lives and like thinking we can be more and more and more sure of things. And then, around that age of like 18 to 22, it kind of gets cut. And then it's like, yeah, that was all kind of bullshit. And you're willing, or, you keep running with it and never have that window. But most people, I think, kind of get out of, they take a breath of fresh air and they're like, whoa, what the hell just happened when they're 20? And then they're like, oh, maybe none of that was exactly the answer. And then there's, as you said, more conversations happening. And then it's like people typically after, in current society, 30, 35, start building more certainty and wanting more certainty, wanting more stability, because I guess it's like, and that's around the time most people maybe will have children or something. And that it's, the willingness to let go of control when you're a parent and like start having more and more responsibilities on that side, I can imagine can be very difficult. And then the other thing I want to say with the enthusiasm, you said like that enthusiasm should be encouraged. And I had no idea that it was the enthusiasm of being willing to be uncertain, like the enthusiasm about a given mentality. I was thinking about it as just, I'm a guy who likes posting videos and like putting stuff out there and sharing things. I did not realize that too, the depth. And I guess so much of this is probably going to be about the depth of things, of understanding, because like that enthusiasm for and like willingness to be uncertain, because there's a lot enthusiastic about, the other end of that spectrum.
Yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun because I forget that, again, going into this, there was a fairly large gap between how you were looking at this and how I look at this, right? Like I'm seeing another awareness that could possibly recognize that it is connected to everything. And you were looking at this, going into it, going, this is going to be a fun conversation. I might learn some new concepts. So this is going to be an entertaining commentary series.
Yeah, definitely. And I had a thought that it totally went away. And that's cool. Yeah, let's keep watching.
Become vastly more shut off. And I was waking up in that, trying to talk to people about this. And there was a few, not many, but the majority was just get back into line. Like, this doesn't make me feel safe. I want to feel safe. Stop talking about all these questions and let's just settle on what we're supposed to do. Just get to work, Ray, was often what I would get. I actually had somebody around my age call me a nonconformist.
Sounds like an amazing compliment.
Right? I'm like, but that was the whole thing. And it's because we didn't want to question it. There was a few, but not many. And now there's so many people like you who are questioning it that I'm excited to have this conversation, Andrew. I really am. And again, the fact that you have so many questions means that I can sit here and just, basically be myself, because over the last 20 years, I've more or less just settled into silence for the most part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like I love talking to people, but when I'm on my own, I talk to myself, and it's just as good, if not better. And that's something I will say that I was really excited about, because that was a frustration for me. I wanted to talk to people about this stuff. I wanted to make content, but when I was left to my own, I would more or less just sit there and go, but why? About what? I don't have any problems I really want to chew on. And so when I started on TikTok, it was challenging for me. And so I figured, okay, well, I can make videos about some of the insights that I'm going through, or insights I'm talking to my daughter about, or I'm talking to Melissa about, things like that. But having an opportunity to go into an ongoing conversation with somebody who was just starting to chew on all of this shit, not for the first time, but to a deeper degree, was really exciting. I was pretty stoked. I still am, honestly.
Yeah. And because there were, things, and it's a lot of it for me has been a shift away from like, the go-to kind of repeated sort of mental health reminder type things. And there was still like a lot of that in me back then, like keeping things in mind, right way to think, right way to act, right things to do. Like there was still, I had massive ideas about the right way to act in terms of like being a quote unquote spiritual person at this point. And so, yeah, the conversation and that was the other thing, was like, for me, it was very much quote unquote the conversation, as opposed to just me being myself. Whatever happens, everything's on the table at all times, sort of thing.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the time period between 15 to 30, because it seems like after that sort of 30, even I'm getting to the point now with friends that I've had a couple of conversations in the last 2 months, and they haven't really gone anywhere. Some of them have, and I've like sort of broken through some understandings, but some of them it's not even close. And it seems like after that, 25, 30-year-old mark, whenever it is, that people just start saying that's just the way it is when you start asking questions. And that response, it's just the way it is, has been becoming more and more interesting to me. And it's like, is it though? Is it really? Is it the way it is?
Let's talk about that a bit. Yeah.
Do you just don't want to get into it, and you want to, again, stay safe and comfortable, and seemingly this illusion of sturdiness or whatever?
That's it, right? And it's a shame, because we often don't recognize that our discomfort, our suffering, our conflict comes from that desire to stagnate. It comes from that desire to just settle on something and kind of nest until death. And Krishnamurti did a really good job of explaining this visual, that living in the moment is very much like just being in the river, whereas settling on a concept, on an answer, and an identity is like making a pool off to the side of the river that just stagnates and eventually turns to sludge. And that's very much the point, because if we're not constantly being refreshed in the moment, we start to die inside, right? We start to come into conflict with everything. All of a sudden, everything around us is the problem, because we no longer have this constant renewable source of insight. And so it's difficult, and it's interesting that you're seeing that already, because and I know from when I was in my 20s, it was very frustrating. It was very frustrating to see more and more of my friends settling for the cheap high of egotistical superiority.
Yeah, been seeing quite a bit about that, and I'm not. I never describe myself as controversial, but recently it seems like, based on responses that I get, and
that
how
sounds
much
controversial.
Yeah, it's becoming, and I guess, it's fair. I've been posting about how there is no good or, like, just recently, because it's so fresh, I posted a video about how there's no good or bad and everything is just perception. And I've gotten 5 different people, at least that's what I've seen, DMs about how it always comes back to killing, and everyone's like, killing is objectively bad. And I went through, posted probably 5 videos on my Instagram story today talking about how it's still just your individual subjective perception. And there are scenarios where a lot of people would agree that killing is not bad. And at the end of the day, when it comes to good and bad, you can't see the future, so you can't know. And that's what it comes back to, is you just can't predict the future. So anything in your life, and it comes back to, there's so many things that it applies to, like worry. You're worried because you think you know what's best. And so you worry that it will happen. You hope that it will happen.
I just think it's so funny how, and I know we're constantly circling around the same sort of stuff, but like right fucking today, Pam on Patreon was talking about how she's talking with her friends about how, it's just your opinion. Something happens, you spill something, you think it's a bad thing, someone gets a dirty floor or something. It's only ever your opinion. And we were going back and forth, everyone on the call, for like 30 minutes talking about this exact thing, and just how it's the same. It's like a variation of the same thing, like the willingness to let go of that false certainty, like that feeling like if you know what's good or bad, you can know that, and then you can choose to do one or the other, and then have control based on, again, no idea beyond right now. So it's just, again, and this is just going to keep coming up, how funny it is how it's like the same sorts of things, and just today felt like a brand new conversation from this perspective, just with a lot more experience since this conversation.
And you fear that it won't happen, but you don't know what's best. So you might be worrying about the best case scenario.
Yep. And
it's kind of puts your worried mind in this sort of pretzel, because all of a sudden it's like, well, shit,
what do I
then
do?
I guess there's no worry, right? And it's like, ding, ding, ding.
That's it. Uncertainty, oddly enough, is where you're at your best, right? And that's it. It's like, you could worry, because I had clients when I was life coaching who would say, like, okay, so what I've got to do is I've got to stop thinking this way. It's like, no, you don't have to. It's not It's not that you gotta. It's not that you need to. You can continue thinking the way you think right now, but you're going to continue to get the same response. Right. So it's not an obligation. Don't make it a should. It's never going to work that way. It actually has to be right here, right now. Am I tired of judging myself into paralysis? Am I tired of holding on to what I think just for the sake of not feeling uncertain? And that's a tricky one. It's a catch-22, right? Because you're telling people, like, you will feel better about uncertainty by just embracing it. Well, that doesn't help. Like, I want to feel better. It's like, it's not how that works, right? I remember one of my first posts when I was life coaching, I don't know, about 10 years ago, was the difference between feeling better and getting better, right? Because you can go to the gym, right? And if it's about feeling better, you're going to pick up the weight that's comfortable. And as soon as you get to the weight that's not, you're going to put it down. And you're not going to try and push past that at all, because it doesn't feel good, does it? No. But if you want to get better, If you want to get stronger, you have to go through that discomfort. You have to pick up that heavier weight. You have to push yourself beyond your limits, and that's getting better. But everybody's so focused on trying to feel better that, we never push ourselves to that next weight because, I couldn't lift it today and I can't stop thinking about myself. So therefore I'm a failure. It's never going to work out. And now I have this giant narrative just because I failed to pick up that weight once.
And that's it, right? It's not just about pushing yourself to pick up the weight, but it's pushing yourself to go beyond the narrative that you can't. Right? And all the complaints, it's too much for you or that you're not enough. You're pushing yourself beyond that habitual self-narrative, that habitual story. And that's really it. And we're always talking about that. And I love the fact that we've been consistent in that, at least, is that it's not about getting to a certain point. It's about being able to go through the shit. It's about being able to go through the shit without resistance to going through the shit. So that way you can get more out of it, learn more from it, and then the shit changes.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting how few want to go through that. And then, like you mentioned, with the should or the have to, it's like you give a piece of advice or something, and they're like, oh, so I should do this, or what should I do? And there are a lot of people out there who do say you should do this, or you have to if you want to do this. And it's like, I'm not saying you have to by any means, and I'm not even saying that you should. I'm just saying that you can if you want to, and you're the only one who can. Nobody. And that's what it comes back to. And you talk about a lot is the responsibility aspect of it. Like for anything, really, it comes back to the responsibility, and you don't have to take responsibility, but you will continue to suffer until you kind of realize that.
Yeah, that's it, right? It's uncomfortable as hell, but it's more uncomfortable to avoid.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's it. It's the difference between, tearing off the Band-Aid or letting the wound fester.
Yeah.
Right. And
oh man, there's like it's so tough for me. Like I want to talk over every single bit that we do here, but the responsibility and my perspective, just how much that's changed, because responsibility is going to depend upon how you see yourself. And so it's like at this point, I can say like it was very much responsibility within a very, limited perspective of myself. Like talk about as, awareness comes with all facets. And as that expands, there's more considerations. There is quote unquote more responsibility, but it's not like this more thing. It's still just here now. It's just that at this point, I was here now, doing the same sort of things, just with very much an idea of myself being responsible for. But then again, it's like that's kind of the process of it, and being responsible in so many different ways, but also of just how I'm feeling and being willing to recognize that it's not on anyone else. And so we're always going through cycles of that, seeing more and more and more of what it means to be self-responsible. And so it like changes, but also it's still just here now. Like it's not so much of a story as you may try and make it into. And so as much as things have changed, like they haven't also.
And we don't want to tear off the Band-Aid, because then we have to look at the wound. We have to come to grips with the fact that we've been putting it off, right? Like there's so much we have to deal with. And I remember one day I was buying weed and I was sitting at my dealer's place. This was before it was legal. And there was another guy there, and he was also buying, but he was a devout Christian. And so, I had a toke, we're talking, we're doing all that. And he tells me that he hasn't been able to see his son in 20 years. And it's because he was drunk and he had a criminal record and he lost custody of his kid way back when, and that he's never going to see his kid again. I'm like, well, your kid's got to be in his 20s now. Like, surely you can reach out. He's like, no, it's just, he'd never forgive me. And, I've got to ask Jesus for forgiveness. I have to ask God to forgive me before I can do anything. And it's like, okay, so what you've done is you've justified paralysis. You've basically just said, I'm not going to do anything, and it's because the universe hasn't told me I have permission to do so. And so you're asking for forgiveness for something that you're not willing to take accountability for. Like, how can you get forgiveness or feel forgiveness if you don't forgive yourself, if you don't understand why you're here? And the response was, without even missing a beat, nope, that's beyond my ability. That's only up to Jesus. And that was the end of the conversation. And it was because I am comfortable in my discomfort. I am familiar with the devil that I know. And that's why it's called The Devil We Know, which is why I loved your video when you responded to my.
I just wanted to say quickly here that I love the fact that just that story in this episode has upset and driven away so many Christians. And it's just because there is a fundamental lack of responsibility in looking to God, in looking to Jesus to point the way. And it may not be a comfortable thing to face, but it is the truth. And until you actually take responsibility for your life, you don't actually understand what Jesus was talking about. You don't understand what God is. You keep thinking it's something that's going to protect you rather than just another description for you.
Admittedly, I poked that question at you because it's fun. What is the devil? And you responded, it's the illusion of separation. It's the perception of division. And that's very much true, which is why I really enjoy the biblical references to the devil as the father of lies, right? Because when you believe your idea of yourself, it's so convincing. It promises you control, just like Jesus's 40 days in the desert, right? It promises all the kingdoms of the world if you have control, if you identify, if you're morally superior. But it doesn't do anything except cause you pain and disconnection. It's that whole, I'd rather reign in hell than serve in heaven, right? I'd rather think I have control.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. Yeah. And the reference to the devil, and then even you've talked a little bit about the story of Adam and Eve, which I've been very intrigued with, and, taking a bite out of the apple of.
And so that point that you made about the false certainty and whatnot, and being willing to let go of that, like at that point, it was the false certainty I had about myself, but it wasn't like constant certainties about myself, assumptions. It was like the general idea. If I were to form a massive idea, I recognized that wasn't it, but it wasn't, there was still very much not the moment to moment assumptions, false certainty I was settling upon about myself, about things happening in reality, opinions, things like that. It was just like a one, which is a big one, that like the idea in general, but it was almost like still an idea I was continuing to maintain, obviously, and still have been, but at least there was the general notion of the conceptual idea isn't me, but it was still being sort of refurbished moment to moment with all that other false certainty.
Knowledge of good and evil, or the tree of knowledge of good and evil and whatnot. And it's interesting because what was the reference to the devil? The being of lies,
The father of lies.
Father of lies.
That's
yeah.
right.
And going back to good and bad, the idea that there is good and bad, and knowledge of good and bad, or judgment, when there is none. It's all
right.
This non-duality, and yet it's like the birth of this feeling of separation.
Yeah.
And it was, caused by the serpent devil, or whatever they say. But it has these. It's been taken so literally, and even though there's a lot of people out there who say it's just they admit it's just a story, they're still taking it as a literal fake story, as opposed to an analogous, or whatever exactly that term is, for what it actually is, and the references and the symbolism of it, which is very, very powerful. And there's so many things, and so many Jesus's teachings that have just been turned half-ass backwards.
Always.
That have been taken just so literally in so many ways, and it wasn't necessarily meant to be. And I think that's what's led to a lot of the misunderstandings, it seems like.
Well, because it's interesting, right? Because you may have noticed this in the last year or even the last 2 months, but
And so I'm realizing now how much like a lot of my focus was on false certainty about religion. And it was like almost working through, and I don't know how the rest of the season is going to play out by any means, but like working through pockets of false certainties as opposed to recognizing that no, it's like any certainty you're holding on to moment to moment. And so it's almost like it was a working through. And so I just saw that with the religion component, how much I started to realize that over the previous couple of years. But it was like that's just one component of reality as opposed to, just the notion of false certainty, period.
well, that's why it's so important to be patient with people, is the understanding that uncertainty as a whole, when you look at it, can be really daunting. So you kind of got to work your way there, especially when you're really overcommitted to certainty, to an answer, to a path, to a strategy, to have the right way, right? Like that's all false certainty, and we really depend on that. So you got to chisel away at that shit kind of slowly, because if you try and take it all away at once, you end up with a nervous breakdown. There's a switch that happens in our perception. It's almost like where we're sitting within our body changes. All of a sudden, it's not that we're, in our body looking out through our eyes, but it's almost like we're sitting behind our eyes looking out at our reality. It's almost like we're in a different state of awareness, like we've just sat in the back seat suddenly and we're looking around going, this is a fun ride. Whereas before we couldn't even stop to admit it was a ride that was happening. We were just so involved with it. And so that perception, that switch of going from a physical body to just an awareness of subjective reality is how the Bible's encoded. I'm absolutely certain of it, is that if you can't see that you are awareness, the Bible makes no sense. I mean, look at the very first commandment. Thou shalt hold no God before me. Well, that's exactly what I would write.
Yeah.
Right? As God. Any awareness, I would say, put no concept of God before yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what I'd write. And that's exactly what the 10 Commandments are getting at, right? Like, look at everything is, Abrahamic religion when it comes to monotheism for the most part. But there was the fact that Israel, which was the name that God bestowed, right? Which was, the whole people of Israel thing. Well, that name just means those who toil with God. Those who are in alignment with what are the people of Israel. Those are the chosen people. It has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with your genetics. It has nothing to do with anything, and everything to do with the fact that when you're in alignment with awareness, you're toiling with or as God.
Yeah.
Right? And so we just get, because you are actually in reality. See, isn't it funny? It's like you're toiling with God. When all that means is that you're actually in reality. You're actually toiling with everything else. Like you're actually in movement with everything else. But until that point, you're in your head. You're in an illusion. So I just find that really funny. I still to this day find that to be one of my favorite quotes.
Yeah. And then it becomes more of that like a murmuration or school of fish or whatever, because there isn't that focus, and how, oh man, how much that shift and like it's cool reflecting on like dualistic unity and community as a whole. It's like, not saying Israel chosen people and all that stuff, but like, it stems from questioning and just a willingness to question that false certainty. So anyone being willing to do that, long enough, like you've said before, eventually gets to this. Oh, I don't know anything. And then you're actually seeing reality.
Get lost in this perception. No, God's got to be this external being, dude in the sky with a list of shit that I'm not supposed to do. And it's like that's a lovely, comforting thought. If you need to judge other people, that will justify your judgment, because then you can say, no, he judges too. Right? But that's the only purpose it has.
Yeah.
And aside from that, everything's our avoidance of death.
Yeah. It's just really just foisting that responsibility onto everything else. And it was interesting when you mentioned like that shift of awareness. I've definitely felt that in the last 2 months, this idea of, it's almost like it was like environment and then Andrew and me are here. It's like I'm at the level of the skin or whatever. And now it's like environment, Andrew, me here. And I'm aware of both Andrew and his environment being everything else as all as one happening.
And I find that really funny because more recently I've sort of had the realization, oh, I'm at the forefront of my eyes, like that experience, literally the opposite of what I'm saying here, and how indicative that is of still very much perceiving. It's like going through perceiving a division. And I'm not doing this from a spot of like, I get something now that I didn't get then. It's just so much more context. Like there's a part of me that's like shifted a lot since then, and a part of me that has not at all. And so with that shift though of perceiving myself as looking through, it's like that is indicative of like that separation from the attachment to that story, but then it's still seeing everything separate from me as opposed to at the forefront of my eyes, whatever. It's like I went in, had still a bunch of shit to work through, but there wasn't quite that one thing in the way. So it opened up the doors to like all the shit in me as me, whatever, that I've been feeling for a while, like, and just continuing to work through. And that's like the ability to then work through it. But you got to recognize like, and not that you gotta, but realize maybe that isn't quite exactly what I am, but there's still a lot there because it's not just the conceptual idea that you're digging through.
Well, and I think it's really important to remember that this episode was recorded before your first psychedelic experience, where you really got launched into holy fuck, I don't know what the hell this is, in a whole other way. So at this point, you're kind of dabbling with uncertainty. You're dabbling with the idea that you're not what you think you are. You're starting to look at, the prison and the idea of being free of that prison, but you're still just getting into it, as am I in a lot of ways. You can tell how excited I am in this conversation. I'm like, fuck, which way do I go with this? What do we talk about? And it's just, it's kind of funny how over time it's like, right. It's just the same conversation. It's going to direct itself. Just have the conversation.
And he, rather than Andrew being the observer and the universe being the observed, I am the observer. Andrew and his environment is the observed, which is how I have seen it. But I've certainly experienced more and more almost every day this feeling of awareness of Andrew, to the point that in a lot of my videos, I'll refer to Andrew in the third person, which people find strange, but it's hard to describe. And it's even hard to explain and make. I found it difficult for a good couple weeks to make videos in the same way that I was, because I was using these terms so differently now. And then I realized that it's just easier to communicate through the way that it can best be received, because there is still value if you are explaining things in an identified way to people, and there is a process of getting there, I believe, certainly. So I got back to, explaining things and using my name and you and saying it in ways that I feel like we're still separate, even though I know we're not, just to better communicate. And that's essentially it. Like you've said, is
Far less.
Oh my God. I've been laughing my ass off. I don't know if this is going to be the recording of us is going to be included on the side here in the tabs, but
sadly, the only person that we can currently see. Oh, no, it flips back and forth between you and I.
Oh, sweet. Okay, awesome. And now I'm like, fuck, I totally forgot I had one that I was doing. What was I even talking about right here? Hold on. We can fucking A. All right. You wanna just play it for a little bit more and I'll tell you
now. And then I realized that it's it's just easier to communicate through
Oh yeah.
the way that it can best be received, because there is still value if you are.
Yeah. And so it's funny how, like, with that and the understanding that hold on. The names, labels, and convenience. And yeah, like right there, it was almost like I was, and not to say that I was seeing anything deeply, but just like recognizing, oh, that's the other thing, was how quickly I glazed over, and people find that to be strange, and then just kept talking. When I was like, refer to Andrew in the third person, it's like, yeah, no fucking shit, people are gonna think you're fucking wild. But it's so funny how, like,
Ray agrees.
yeah, how because it's not about the words or the language, and if you really want to be literal with it, you can't communicate, because you can't talk about something that's unity. You need a unity. You need a perception of division to reference something, but it is only for convenience. And so it's just so funny how I was able to kind of articulate that pretty well right there. But and there's just like so much less, I don't know, just experiences and ways of looking at things, I think.
I find it funny because you've gone through the same, I guess, process numerous times of jettisoning ahead, like leapfrogging ahead, and then coming back and going, oh, right, I should break that down into something that's understandable for people. And now you've just let go of that for the most part entirely. Now you're just like, I'm going to do my thing and people can watch it if they want to, which is really, I guess, the next evolution of the point. You are the point, right? And if you're the point, what you're getting across is that they're also the point, because you're not really ever saying, I'm the point, except to yourself, right? You're reminding them it's all about the experience that you're having. So it's interesting to see how far you've come.
Explaining things in an identified way to people, and there is a process of getting there, I believe, certainly. So I got back to, explaining things and using my name and you and saying it in ways that I feel like we're still separate, even though I know we're not, just to better communicate. And that's essentially it. Like you've said, is
far less confusing.
Yeah, for sure. But it's been interesting, because I did have a tough time for a little while. And my only videos for a good week after that sort of like realization was about this idea of not being the human you've been conditioned to believe that you are. And it's simply an illusion.
Yeah. Well, and that's it, right? And it's interesting. I find I go through waves, and I think you'll probably do the same.
Real quick, I just want to say how funny it is still saying like explain. I'm finding better ways to explain this to people, and just how specific it's, like explaining a very specific thing. Correct way of saying it, I'm then this, and how just back and forth. If you have some fucking idea of yourself as explaining something, being a quote unquote teacher or something, which never had a strong idea of that, but there was definitely that I get something that other people don't, and how much that gets in the way of anything close to an explanation, which I'm not saying there is, but just expression, not explanation, expression of what it is. Because if you're maintaining being a fucking teacher, you're still very much seeing yourself in a certain way. So it's not even, you can't even think of yourself as explaining it.
That's good. I like that. That was a nice catch. Where I'll have just a span of time where all of a sudden the insights hit me over and over and over again. And people will call that a download. I just look at it as me being in a state where there's less stress and more time to just kind of relax and allow myself to absorb exactly how much I've absorbed. And then that'll go deep, and you'll get so deep into it that people will start going, okay, I'm not sure if I'm following this. And you're like, it doesn't matter. This is awesome. I'm going. And you just keep going. And then you come back a little bit later and you go, okay, now let's unpack that. Let's look at how that actually works out from the beginning to the end, because you're too busy down at the end of the road to worry about the first few steps, right? And sometimes you have to do that just to get more familiar with the path. But not everybody's going to understand you when you do that. which is great. And it's funny because like one post I made a little while ago, I don't remember, it was one of my short ones, which are usually the ones you have to watch out for, because the short ones are the ones where I'm like, oh, this is very good, and I'm just going to leave it at this. That at some point we become aware that the only thing that we are aware of is our awareness, and that the entirety of the universe that we are quote unquote aware of is our awareness. That there is nothing to us except our awareness. We don't know anything but our awareness, and we never have. Everything else is hearsay. You know, and this is talking to people on who've explored psychedelics. I've often said, do yourself a favor next time you do that. Ask yourself, if you weren't here, would anything else be? And that just sets the tone, because normally in a sober state of mind, we just go, well, of course, and we disregard it, and that's the end of the conversation, right? But when you start looking at it and you start questioning, it's like, hold on a second. In all honesty, the only thing I know is everything from the moment that I came into existence. This could all be a dream. All of these people could just be an extension of myself. None of this could be what it appears to be. It's like, well, what about history? Still hearsay. Mm-hmm. Still hearsay, regardless of how many books or dinosaur bones or blah, blah, blah. The fact is, the only thing I know is my existence. And that conversation is what makes people go running for the hills, because that means that you are alone. Right? And you are forever. That's the thing that really trips people up, and is like, because we think of it in terms of identity. All of a sudden it's like, this makes me feel very lonely. It's like, right, because you're still thinking about yourself as separate. Mm-hmm. That's the only place that loneliness comes in.
So this is something I don't know if I'm completely following you at this part. So, because I remember I posted a video maybe a month or so ago talking about how I'm the awareness and so are you. And I'm aware of the voice inside of Andrew's head no differently than I'm aware of a tree, or I'm aware of the ground that he is standing on no differently than I'm aware of something on his body hurting. Mm-hmm. Something like that. So the awareness stays the same. And I think you commented something like, but you are the aware of the awareness, or the awareness of that awareness. So it's like one more step. So how does that? Yeah.
So like the tree, for example, that you are aware of is aware of itself.
And so at this point, like, I very much see myself as like set back in my head, seeing and being that point there that sees then Andrew and is viewing almost like this body as something separate. And so it's like, it's almost like everything was separate, entirely separate, as opposed to nothing being separate. And that was basically, I think, what's been unraveling for the rest of all of this. And I think it took about a year for me to shift, not out of that, but like, I remember that being my experience. So there wasn't so much concern for what happened to this meat suit. There still certainly was in a lot of ways. And I didn't quite realize how much it's like, it can be situational. Like, you can feel amazing and free as fuck, like in certain situations, and then incredibly terrified, nervous, worried in other situations. It's not like this fucking baseline sort of thing where it's like, oh, it's all gone. It's like you work through things. But at this point, I think I was, I don't want to say arrogant, but like, I thought that it was kind of like figured out, as opposed to, and not to say that going through experiences that are less comfortable is on your process to figuring it out, but it's not thinking that you're getting or doing anything, or not having a resistance, even if it's subtle, because there can be subtle resistances to certain types of situations that you can pass off. And so I think a big process, at least, of realizing this for me was jumping into social media, doing podcasts, just continuing to be willing to do things that made me uncomfortable. But I definitely had this idea of, like, everything was separate at this point, and that takes away almost the responsibility for anything. There was still, it's not entirely like I didn't have that mentality, but yeah. Anyway, it was that's how I was seeing things back then.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if it's necessarily that everything was separate so much as you were really Andrew. And that was really changing, is that your idea of Andrew just kept getting chipped away. You were letting go of being that idea, like letting go, but then you were holding on to other ideas that weren't necessarily labeled Andrew, but were still a part of what you thought of yourself. And so that's why it's so difficult for you to see, for anybody to see, that your awareness and my awareness and the awareness of the tree are all awareness, singular. It's difficult because we're so busy thinking about ourselves as the source of and only possessor of this awareness, rather than seeing awareness as something universal, because you can't, as long as you're focused on yourself. As long as you're thinking about yourself, everything else is separate. So that's the process. And it really kicked into high gear by the time the first retreat came along. Right? The tree is aware of itself in whatever capacity that is expressed, because it's not human, so it doesn't have a human brain. It doesn't think of itself as, my tree Bob. It doesn't do that, right? But it is aware of itself. It's aware of the feeling of the sun against it. It's aware of the wind. It's aware when it loses disconnection with the roots or the ground. It's aware of these things. So the problem that we have is that we tend to separate Andrew's awareness, or the awareness of Andrew, from the awareness of the tree, right? Because as much as you're experiencing awareness of the tree, the tree is also experiencing awareness of itself, but neither Andrew or the tree are real. It's the same awareness. It's the exact same awareness. It's kind of like how mushrooms grow. Mushrooms grow from mycelium, right? Mycelium is underneath the ground, and mycelium is the reason that we have lush forests and that we have soil that's so healthy. But mushrooms themselves are actually just the fruit. They're not the plant. Mushrooms just sprout from mycelium. And so each mushroom is an expression of the same mycelium. It comes from the same place. It has the same potential. It's just expressed differently, but it's connected despite its perception of being disconnected. Right? Each mushroom is connected to the other mushrooms, even though they're not intimately aware of each other's experience. It's the same thing with all of us. We're all connected by the same mycelium. We are all the same I. Right? We just have the perspective of division. So when, and this is something you really experience in coaching, or it's something you experience in a lot of physical therapies, where you let go of the idea of yourself and you find yourself having an intuitive connection to people. And it's because your awareness and theirs is the same awareness. It's just our holding on to the divisions that cause so much distortion and so much confusion, right? Every time you have a moment of genuine empathy with somebody, it's because your walls come down and you're able to see yourself in that person. That's the whole thing. You can see yourself in that person because you are that person. That's the whole reason. That's why you can empathize. That's why I always say that regardless of what form you take, if you can have this conversation about the relationship between the observer and the observed, you're always going to have this conversation, because it's the universal experience of everything that is aware, because everything is the same awareness.
Yeah.
Now, again, I spent 20 years and just unpacking this. And I know you're saying, like, I don't know if I fully get that. Neither do I. Yeah. What I can say is that in my moments of clarity, yeah, it rings through. The deeper it goes, the more clear I become, the more obvious it is that the entirety of reality is just one thing. It's just, when you've said it many, many times, it's difficult to let go of me. It's difficult to let go of the idea of me.
I think I'm pretty close to fully understand the idea that we're all the same thing. It's interesting, like when people will ask, well, how can we be the same? Like, is it just that strong of an illusion that I feel like, right now I'm waving Andrew's right hand and you can't wave my right hand?
Oddly enough, right. I just did.
Right.
And that is a perfect spot for us to end part 1 of our episode 1 commentary, because we're only halfway through the episode. But it is so difficult to wrap one's mind around, because one is thinking about themselves. And so I thought this episode was perfect because it really gets into the meat of the conversation. But on the other hand, it acknowledges there's so much more. Like, there's not just coming to an answer, it's digging at that answer over and over and over again while it manages to penetrate what is your current way of thinking.
Oh, I just want to say how epic of a spot to pause that is. Like, I just kind of got goosebumps because, like, I'm not saying that's all of it right there, but it's like that is the gap between thinking that I just raised Andrew's hand, that's all I can do, and recognizing myself. And last thing I'll say just on this little bit is I very much still had a strong desire to explain it and like be able to explain it. And I have maintained that to varying degrees throughout, and like have probably the least desire at this point right now today to explain it and like get something across, because there has to be a me who's explaining it. And the reason to get better at explaining it is for myself, for Andrew, very much. And so I still had a lot of that I wanted, and that's why I wanted to understand what you were saying so bad. It's funny because I jotted down baby steps because I was like, oh, I respected. He said something just before that, like and the tree example that I mentioned, like awareness of the tree, awareness of, I was like, oh, this is great. Like Ray's taking baby steps. That's awesome. And then he just like ran right through and then ending on this. And it was like a willingness. And that's where you see me like, I don't know what the fuck this dude is saying right now, but I wanted to, like, I really wanted to get it, to understand it. And so that's kind of been, you know, that the drive for a lot of this. But this is a fucking fun episode. This series is going to be a lot of fun. So yeah, appreciate everyone for tuning in and following along with us.
No, I'm really excited about this, just for the simple fact that you're willing to question things. And so what we started talking about, you're like, yeah, I get that. Okay. And I get that. And this all makes sense. And then I went, all right, now if you take that far enough, you're everything. And so the podcast after that was, maybe we should discuss that gap. Maybe we should discuss how all of that applies to all of that. So that way it makes sense to some degree. And unfortunately, it'll never make sense in the way that we want it to, in terms of it being conceptual, but it can make sense in terms of it being an ongoing way of living. It can actually make sense if it's about your life now, because then it's not about a concept. It's about self-knowledge. It's about balance. It's about awareness and responsibility and accountability and all that other fun stuff, without it being about any of those things, because of course those are concepts. So as the first part of the first episode of the podcast, it's fucking awesome in my opinion.
Yeah, as I said, this is going to be a lot of fun, and just that gap, like that's what the podcast has been, is going through that, and just how much it informs everything that you do, because it can't be, you need the concepts to try and to like have a conversation about it. But then it's like getting to that point, like you said with Wing Chun, you know, you lose all the move, or you learn all the moves, you learn all the moves, and then you forget about them. And then it's the ability to have the sensitivity. And that's like the shift from talking about it to the application, which is, it's not even a conversation, because it's just whatever you're doing. It's just whatever's in front of you. That's it. And so you can't even really talk about that, because that's infinite. That's infinite potential, what you're doing right now. But anyway,
exactly. Hell yeah, this has been a fun commentary episode. Thanks so much everyone for joining us. We're going to do this again at some point in the near future, because obviously we got to cover the second part of episode 1, and then personally I'm very excited to get into episode 2 and 3, where Andrew has had a psychedelic experience and has really opened himself up to the subjective experience of reality, suddenly willing to look at it entirely from the mind, not just from the mind of a body. And so that conversation is going to be a lot of fun. But first, the second half of episode 1. But this has been a blast, man.
It's been a lot of fun. I just remembered that we live streamed this too. I was thinking we were just alone on here, but yeah, this has been a blast. Appreciate everyone everyone who tuned in live, and appreciate everyone who's listening after. I'm excited for part 2.
Hell yeah. We love you, everyone. We'll see you soon.